Hello, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel After Dark. Tonight we're drifting off into the history of Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian noblewoman and serial killer from the powerful House of Bathory, who owned land in the Kingdom of Hungary, now Slovakia. Bathory and four of her servants were accused of torturing and killing hundreds of girls and women from 1590 to 1610. Let's dive in. In the heart of 16th century Hungary, where the Carpathian Mountains cast long shadows across vast estates and ancient bloodlines ruled with absolute authority, a child was born who would become one of history's most notorious figures. This is the story of Elizabeth Bathory, a woman whose name would echo through the centuries, wrapped in darkness and whispered with fear. The year was 1560. And in the Kingdom of Hungary, the Bathory family stood among the most powerful noble houses in all of Eastern Europe. On a summer day in August, Elizabeth was born into this world of privilege and power at Nyírbátor, the family estate that stretched as far as the eye could see across the Hungarian plains. From her very first breath, she was destined for greatness, or perhaps, as some would later claim, for infamy. Elizabeth's lineage was nothing short of extraordinary, her family tree intertwined with royalty itself. Her uncle, Stephen Bathory, would ascend to become the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. The Bathory name commanded respect and fear in equal measure, and young Elizabeth grew up surrounded by the trappings of immense wealth and political influence. The castles she called home were filled with servants who bowed at her presence, and the finest tutors in the realm were summoned to educate her. But there was something else woven into the Bathory bloodline, something darker that whispered through the family history. The practice of intermarriage among noble families, meant to preserve power and purity of blood, had consequences that manifested in troubling ways. Elizabeth herself was said to suffer from severe headaches and seizures throughout her childhood, afflictions that some historians believe may have been symptoms of epilepsy. These episodes would strike without warning, leaving the young countess trembling and disoriented, her attendants rushing to her aid as she recovered from the violent fits that racked her small frame. Yet despite these challenges, Elizabeth proved herself to be remarkably intelligent and well-educated for a woman of her time. She was fluent in multiple languages. Hungarian, Latin, and German flowed from her tongue with equal ease. This was extraordinary in an era when many noble women received only basic instruction in domestic matters. Elizabeth could read and write with sophistication, engage in political discourse, and navigate the complex social hierarchies of European aristocracy. Her tutors marveled at her quick mind and her hunger for knowledge, though some would later wonder if perhaps she learned too much, read too widely, delved too deeply into subjects that might have been better left unexplored. As Elizabeth moved through her childhood years, growing from a delicate girl into a striking young woman, her beauty became legendary throughout the Hungarian territories. She possessed pale, luminous skin that seemed almost translucent in candlelight, dark hair that cascaded down her back like a midnight river, and eyes that held an intensity that made even hardened nobles look away. But beneath this beautiful exterior, something else was beginning to take shape, something that would not fully reveal itself for many years to come. At the tender age of 10, Elizabeth's fate was sealed through the customs of her time. She was betrothed to Ferenc Nadasdy, a young nobleman from another powerful Hungarian family. This arrangement was not born of romance, but of political strategy. Two great houses joining forces to consolidate power and expand their influence across the turbulent landscape of 16th century Hungary. Ferenc was 15 at the time of their engagement, already training to become the warrior that his position demanded. The young count was being groomed to defend Hungarian territories against the constant threat of Ottoman invasion, to lead armies and claim victories on the battlefield. For 5 years, Elizabeth and Ferenc remained engaged, their futures intertwined by the machinations of their families. During this time, Elizabeth continued her education at the Nádasdy Castle, learning the skills she would need to manage vast estates and command hundreds of servants. But there was an incident during these formative years that hinted at the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. At the age of 13, before her marriage, Elizabeth became pregnant by a young peasant man. The scandal could have destroyed her marital prospects and brought shame upon the Bathory name. But such matters were handled swiftly and brutally in the world of Hungarian nobility. The peasant lover simply disappeared, his fate unknown but easily imagined. The child, a daughter, was quietly whisked away and given to a peasant family to raise, erased from Elizabeth's story as if she had never existed. Finally, in 1575, when Elizabeth was 15 years old, the wedding took place. It was a spectacle of unimaginable grandeur, with guests traveling from across Hungary and beyond to witness the union. The celebration lasted for days, with feasting and entertainment that drained the coffers of both families. Elizabeth arrived at the ceremony dressed in fabric so fine it seemed woven from moonlight itself, her dark hair adorned with jewels that caught the light of 1,000 candles. But in a gesture that spoke volumes about the young bride's spirit, and perhaps presaged the independence she would later claim, Elizabeth did not take her husband's name. She remained Elizabeth Bathory, a countess in her own right, unwilling to be subsumed completely into another family's identity. The newlyweds took up residence at Countess Castle, a formidable fortress perched in the Little Carpathians Mountains, in what is now Slovakia. The castle would become Elizabeth's primary residence, her domain, her kingdom. Its stone walls rose gray and imposing against the mountain sky, its towers watching over the villages below, where peasants toiled in the shadow of their noble masters. Here, Elizabeth would rule over an estate that encompassed dozens of villages and thousands of subjects. Here, she would give birth to her children and manage vast wealth and resources. And here, eventually, the darkest chapters of her story would unfold. But in those early years of marriage, Elizabeth was, by all accounts, a devoted wife and a capable administrator. Her husband Ferenc, who earned the nickname the Black Knight of Hungary for his fierce reputation in battle, was frequently away fighting the Ottoman Turks who pressed against Hungary's borders. Sometimes he would be gone for months or even years at a time, leaving Elizabeth to manage their estates alone. And manage them she did, with an iron will and a sharp mind that impressed even the male administrators who served under her. She handled finances, settled disputes, corresponded with other nobles, and ensured that the Nádasdy Bathory holdings remained profitable and secure. As our story continues, we stand at a threshold. Elizabeth Bathory is now a powerful countess, educated, beautiful, and commanding vast resources. She has survived a scandal, entered into a political marriage, and begun to establish herself as a force to be reckoned with in Hungarian society. But the events that would transform her from a mere noble woman into a legend of horror have not yet begun. The stage is set, the players are in place, and the long, dark shadow of history is beginning to fall across Countess Castle. As the 16th century drew toward its close, Elizabeth Bathory found herself in a position that few women of her era could claim. She was the undisputed mistress of a vast empire of land and subjects, ruling alone while her husband carved out his legend on distant battlefields. The years between 1575 and 1604 would shape Elizabeth in ways that no one could have predicted, transforming the educated young bride into something far more complex, far more powerful, and perhaps far more dangerous. Ferenc Nadasdy was rarely home. His reputation as a military commander grew with each passing year, and the Ottoman threat along Hungary's borders demanded constant vigilance. The Turks had been pressing into Hungarian territory for decades, and Ferenc positioned himself at the forefront of the defense, leading cavalry charges and siege operations that would earn him both glory and the fierce nickname by which history would remember him. While other nobles might visit their estates between campaigns, Ferenc seemed to live for battle, for the clash of steel and the thunder of hoofbeats. He would depart for months at a time, leaving behind only letters and the occasional spoils of war, captured Turkish soldiers, exotic weapons, and tales of victory. And so Elizabeth ruled. From the heights of Countess Castle, she managed an economic enterprise of staggering complexity. The Nadasdy estates encompassed 17 properties scattered across Hungary and the Kingdom of Hungary's territories. Thousands of peasants worked the fields and vineyards that stretched across the landscape, all ultimately answering to the Countess. Elizabeth proved herself to be a shrewd administrator, maintaining detailed records of every transaction, every harvest, every debt owed and payment due. She conducted business correspondence in multiple languages, negotiated contracts with merchants and other nobles, and defended her family's interests in legal disputes with a tenacity that earned her respect, and perhaps some fear, among her peers. But Elizabeth's duties extended beyond mere accounting and correspondence. In her husband's absence, she was also responsible for maintaining discipline among the household staff and the peasant population. And it was here, in these years of solitary rule, that darkness began to seep into the story. The methods Elizabeth employed to maintain order became increasingly harsh. Servants who displeased her faced punishments that went far beyond the stern rebuke or temporary dismissal common in other noble households. There were whispers, even in these early years, of cruelty that exceeded the bounds of acceptable discipline, though such rumors remained contained within the castle walls and the surrounding villages. Despite the long separations, Elizabeth's marriage to Ferenc did produce children. Between 1578 and 1598, she gave birth to 5 children, 3 daughters and 2 sons, though one son died in infancy. There was Anna, born in 1585, Ursula in 1590, Catalin in 1594, and finally Pal, who survived to adulthood. Elizabeth was, by various accounts, attentive to her children's education and upbringing, ensuring they received instruction befitting their status. Yet she remained emotionally reserved, perhaps shaped by her own upbringing and the cold formality of aristocratic life, or perhaps simply by the isolation that came with her position. Her children were raised primarily by wet nurses and governesses, as was customary among the nobility, while Elizabeth focused her attention on the management of the estates and the expansion of her influence. During these years, Elizabeth's household at Countess Castle grew into a small court of its own. She surrounded herself with servants and attendants, but also with individuals who held more ambiguous positions, advisors, companions, and facilitators whose roles would later become the subject of intense scrutiny. Among these was a woman named Anna Darvulia, who entered Elizabeth's service sometime in the 1590s. Darvulia, described as a widow with knowledge of folk remedies and traditional practices, became Elizabeth's closest confidant. Their relationship was intense and exclusive. Darvulia seemed to exert considerable influence over the Countess, and some later accounts would suggest that it was Darvulia who encouraged Elizabeth's growing obsession with preserving her legendary beauty and stemming the inevitable tide of aging. For Elizabeth was aging, as all mortals must. By the time she reached her 30s, the pale perfection of her youth was beginning to show the first subtle signs of time's passage. In an era when a woman's value was so intimately tied to her physical appearance and ability to attract advantageous attention, this must have weighed heavily on someone as vain and as conscious of her power as Elizabeth had become. She began to devote more time and resources to beauty treatments, consulting with Darvulia and others who claimed knowledge of preservatives and rejuvenating potions. Herbs and ointments were procured at great expense. Rituals were performed in private chambers. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Elizabeth's focus began to shift from mere vanity towards something approaching obsession. The late 1590s brought significant changes to Elizabeth's life. In 1596, Ferenc transferred the administration of all Nadasdy family estates to Elizabeth, officially granting her complete authority over their holdings. This was an extraordinary gesture of trust, or perhaps an acknowledgement of her superior management skills, and it placed Elizabeth among the most powerful women in all of Hungary. She now controlled wealth equivalent to that of minor kings, commanded the loyalty of thousands, and answered to no one save the distant monarch. The power was intoxicating, and Elizabeth wielded it with increasing confidence and, some would later say, increasing ruthlessness. But even as Elizabeth's temporal power reached its zenith, tragedy stalked the edges of her life. Her children, despite their privileged status, faced the same dangers that threatened all people in that era of limited medicine and unpredictable fate. Disease swept through communities without warning. Accidents claimed lives with cruel randomness. And even within the protected walls of castles, death was never far away. Elizabeth watched one of her infant sons die, a grief that she bore with the stoic dignity expected of her station, though what private anguish she may have felt remained locked behind the mask she presented to the world. Then, in 1600, a figure entered the household who would play a crucial role in the dark events to come. Her name was Ursabet Jo, though she was known by various names and titles, and she came recommended as a servant with particular skills in household management. But Jo was more than a mere servant. She was rumored to have knowledge of the occult, of spells and potions, of the darker practices that existed in the shadows of Christian Hungary, where old pagan beliefs still lingered despite centuries of religious orthodoxy. Whether Elizabeth actively sought out such a person or whether Jo simply presented herself an opportune moment remains unclear, but her arrival marked a turning point. Under Jo's influence, or perhaps with Jo as a willing accomplice to desires that already lurked in Elizabeth's heart, the punishments inflicted on servants grew more severe, more imaginative in their cruelty, more difficult to explain away as mere discipline. The year 1604 brought an event that would alter everything. Ferenc Nadasdy, the Black Knight of Hungary, Elizabeth's husband of nearly 30 years, died. The official cause was given as an illness contracted during one of his military campaigns, possibly from an infected wound that never properly healed. He was only 47 years old, still vigorous and active until illness struck him down. Ferenc was mourned across Hungary as a hero, a defender of Christian Europe against the Ottoman tide. Elaborate funeral ceremonies were held, and tributes poured in from nobles and commoners alike. For Elizabeth, Ferenc's death represented both a loss and a liberation. Whatever genuine affection may have existed between them, and there are suggestions that despite the political nature of their union, they had developed a certain partnership built on mutual respect, she was now truly alone in her power. No husband to answer to, no masculine authority to defer to, no one to question her decisions or moderate her impulses. At 44 years old, Elizabeth Bathory was a widow of immense wealth and influence, the sole administrator of vast estates and answerable to no one. The constraints that had perhaps kept her darker tendencies in check were now gone. The stage was set for the transformation of Countess Elizabeth Bathory from powerful noblewoman into something that would haunt the nightmares of generations to come. In the villages surrounding Countess Castle, young women and girls began to disappear with alarming frequency. Behind the castle's stone walls, screams that had once been muffled and sporadic became more frequent, more desperate, and the Countess, obsessed with preserving her fading beauty and convinced of her absolute immunity from consequences, descended deeper into acts that would ultimately brand her as one of history's most prolific serial killers. But those horrors were only beginning to unfold, and the full truth of what transpired in those dark years would not come to light for several more years. For now, Elizabeth stood at the peak of her power, surveying her domain from the towers of Countess Castle, believing herself untouchable, unaccountable, and perhaps, in her own twisted mind, justified in whatever she chose to do. The years following Ferencz's death marked the beginning of Elizabeth Bathory's transformation from aristocratic widow into the figure that would haunt history's darkest pages. Between 1604 and 1610, within the stone walls of Countess Castle and her other properties scattered across Hungary, events unfolded that would eventually shock even a society accustomed to the casual cruelties of feudal power. This was the period when whispers became accusations, when isolated incidents became patterns, and when the Countess's grip on reality, or perhaps her grip on any remaining morality, began to slip away entirely. Elizabeth's obsession with beauty and youth intensified dramatically after Ferencz's death. She was now in her mid-40s, and despite her efforts, the mirror reflected back the inevitable truth. Time was winning its war against her once flawless appearance. Fine lines had appeared at the corners of her eyes and mouth. Her skin, once luminous and taut, had begun to lose its youthful glow. For a woman who had built much of her identity and power on her legendary beauty, who had commanded attention and admiration simply by entering a room, this decline was unbearable. She became consumed with finding ways to reverse the aging process, to restore what time was steadily stealing away. It was during this period that the most sinister aspects of Elizabeth's household came fully into the light, or rather, retreated further into shadow. Her inner circle had consolidated into a small group of individuals who would later become infamous as her accomplices. There was Anna Darvulia, her closest confidant, until Darvulia's death around 1609, possibly from a stroke that left her blind. There was Alona Jo, sometimes called Jo Alona, who had arrived in 1600 and whose knowledge of folk magic and occult practices seemed to align perfectly with Elizabeth's growing desperation. There was Dorothea Senes, known as Dorka, a wet nurse who had served in the household and gradually became one of Elizabeth's most trusted servants. And there was Jano Shigeri, known as Fixco, a dwarf who served in various capacities and who would later be described as Elizabeth's enforcer, carrying out her most brutal commands. Together, this group formed a closed circle around Elizabeth, isolated from the rest of the household staff and from outside scrutiny. They met in private chambers. They spoke in whispers. They carried out tasks that the other servants tried desperately not to witness or acknowledge. And at the center of it all was Elizabeth herself, driven by vanity, convinced of her own invulnerability, and descending into practices that defied comprehension. The victims began to arrive at Cactus Castle under various pretenses. Some were peasant girls from the surrounding villages, sent by their families to serve in the castle household, a position that should have been an honor and an opportunity, but instead became a death sentence. Elizabeth and her accomplices would promise these girls positions as servants or seamstresses, offering wages that seemed generous to impoverished families. Other young women came as apprentices, supposedly to learn skills that would improve their marriage prospects. Still others were daughters of minor gentry, sent to the castle to receive education and polish in the ways of courtly life, their families viewing service in a countess's household as a pathway to better futures for their daughters. But once inside the castle walls, these young women found themselves trapped in a nightmare beyond imagining. The exact nature of what transpired has been pieced together from later trial testimonies, and the accounts are harrowing. Elizabeth, in her twisted quest to preserve her beauty, became convinced that the blood of young virgins held restorative properties. This belief, whether planted by her occult-practicing accomplices or born from her own deteriorating mind, took root and flourished into a horrifying practice. Young women were tortured and killed, their blood collected and used in rituals that Elizabeth believed would restore her youth. The methods of torture were varied and inventive in their cruelty. Some victims were beaten so severely that their bodies turned black with bruises. Others were burned with hot irons or had their hands crushed. In winter, girls might be stripped naked and doused with water, then left outside in the freezing cold until they died. There were reports of victims being forced into iron cages too small to stand in, or covered in honey and left for insects to feast upon their living flesh. The torture sessions often lasted for hours or even days, with Elizabeth herself sometimes participating directly, other times watching from a distance, and occasionally even being splattered with the blood of her victims during particularly violent episodes. Some historical accounts suggest that Elizabeth bathed in the blood of her victims, believing this would transfer their youth and vitality to her aging body. While this particular detail has been debated by historians, some arguing it was a later embellishment added to an already horrific story, there is no debate about the core truth. Elizabeth Bathory tortured and murdered young women in numbers that eventually reached into the dozens, if not hundreds. The exact count remains uncertain, as records were incomplete and many victims simply vanished without any documentation of their arrival or disappearance. Initially, Elizabeth was careful to select victims whose disappearance would attract little attention. Peasant girls from isolated villages, orphans with no families to advocate for them, girls whose parents were too poor or too frightened to question the countess. These were the first victims. Their bodies were disposed of secretly, buried in unmarked graves within the castle grounds, or deposited in remote locations where they might be attributed to wild animals or bandits. The local Lutheran minister, a man named Istvan Magyari, began to notice the alarming frequency with which young women entered the castle and never returned. But his initial inquiries were rebuffed. Who would believe accusations against one of Hungary's most powerful noblewomen? As the years passed and the body count rose, Elizabeth grew increasingly reckless. The power she wielded had convinced her of her own invincibility. She was a Bathory, from one of Hungary's most prestigious families. She was wealthy beyond measure, controlling estates worth more than those of many princes. She had connections to the royal court and to other powerful nobles throughout the region. Surely, she believed, no one would dare to move against her, no matter what rumors might circulate among the peasantry. This sense of immunity led to a fatal error in judgment. Around 1609, Elizabeth began to expand her victim pool beyond peasant girls to include daughters of the lower nobility, girls of gentle birth whose families had influence and connections of their own. She established what she called a school at Countess Castle, ostensibly to educate young noble women in courtly arts and proper deportment. Families sent their daughters, believing this to be a genuine opportunity for advancement. But once these girls entered Elizabeth's household, many of them suffered the same fate as the peasant girls before them. The difference was that when girls of noble birth began to disappear, their families had the means and the motivation to demand answers. Letters were written, questions were asked, pressure began to build in ways that Elizabeth had not anticipated. The rumors that had long circulated in whispers among the lower classes began to reach the ears of people who mattered, people with the power to investigate, to question, and potentially to act. By 1610, Elizabeth had been operating with impunity for at least 6 years, possibly longer if the darker practices had begun even before Ferencz's death. The true number of her victims during this period may never be known. Later testimony at her trial would suggest numbers ranging from dozens to potentially over 600 young women, though this highest figure is disputed by modern historians as likely exaggerated. What is certain is that the disappearances had become too frequent, too obvious to ignore any longer. Meanwhile, Elizabeth continued her daily life as if nothing were amiss. She managed her estates, corresponded with other nobles, attended to the education of her children, and maintained the outward appearance of a proper aristocratic widow. She hosted occasional gatherings at the castle, where she presented herself with all the grace and dignity befitting her station. Those who saw her in these public moments saw only the refined countess, not the monster that dwelt beneath the polished exterior. But in the villages surrounding Countess Castle, fear had taken root. Families warned their daughters to stay away from the castle. Mothers clutched their children closer when the countess's carriages passed through. And slowly, inevitably, the web of power and influence that had protected Elizabeth for so long began to fray. The darkness she had cultivated in secret was beginning to seep out into the light, and forces were gathering that even the mighty Countess Bathory would not be able to withstand. The year 1610 would bring the beginning of the end. Events were already in motion that would tear away the veil of protection Elizabeth had relied upon, that would expose the horrors hidden within Countess Castle's walls, and that would transform Elizabeth Bathory from an untouchable aristocrat into a prisoner, though never quite into a defendant in the way justice would normally demand. The year 1610 began much like any other for Elizabeth Bathory, with the routines of estate management and the secret horrors continuing behind closed doors. But forces were converging that would shatter the illusion of invulnerability she had maintained for so long. The whispers that had circulated for years were becoming louder, more insistent, and crucially, they were reaching the ears of someone with both the power and the motivation to act. Count Georgy Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary and Elizabeth's own cousin. Georgy Thurzo occupied one of the most powerful positions in the Kingdom of Hungary. As Palatine, he served as the king's representative and the highest judicial authority in the land, second only to the monarch himself. He was responsible for maintaining order among the nobility, for investigating serious crimes, and for protecting the interests of the Hungarian crown. Thurzo was also related to Elizabeth through the complex web of intermarriage that connected Hungary's noble families, a connection that would complicate everything that was to come, creating a tension between family loyalty and legal duty that would ultimately shape the strange resolution of Elizabeth's case. The catalyst for action came from multiple directions simultaneously. The Lutheran minister István Magyari had been documenting the disappearances for years, maintaining records of girls who had entered the castle and never returned. By 1610, his evidence had become substantial enough that he felt compelled to act, despite the obvious danger of accusing someone as powerful as Elizabeth Bathory. Magyari compiled his observations into a formal complaint and sent it directly to the authorities in Vienna, bypassing local officials who might be influenced or intimidated by the Countess's power. His letter detailed the suspicious deaths and disappearances, the rumors of torture, and his own observations of the unusual number of burials conducted in secret at odd hours. Simultaneously, families of missing noblewomen were making their own complaints. Unlike the peasant families whose daughters had disappeared earlier, these noble families had access to the court and to officials who could not simply ignore their concerns. Letters arrived at the Palatine's office demanding investigations into the whereabouts of daughters who had been sent to Cactus Castle for education and had not been heard from since. The pressure was mounting, and even someone as powerful as Elizabeth could not suppress all of these voices at once. But there was another factor at play, one more cynical and more practical than simple justice. Elizabeth Bathory was not only powerful, she was also extraordinarily wealthy, and she had been lending money to various nobles, including potentially to the royal treasury itself. The sums involved were substantial, and if Elizabeth were to be convicted of crimes and her property confiscated, those debts would effectively be erased. Some historians have suggested that this financial motivation may have played a significant role in the decision to move against her, though disentangling the threads of justice, family politics, and economic interest in this case remains challenging even centuries later. Count Thurzo faced a delicate situation. The evidence against Elizabeth was mounting, but she was family, a member of one of Hungary's most distinguished houses. A public trial would create an enormous scandal that could damage the reputation of multiple noble families and potentially destabilize political alliances at a time when Hungary could ill afford internal discord. The Ottoman threat remained very real, and unity among the nobility was crucial for national defense. Thurzo needed to find a way to stop Elizabeth's crimes while minimizing the damage to the social order and to his own family's honor. In the summer and autumn of 1610, Thurzo launched a careful investigation. He gathered testimony from former servants who had fled the castle, from villagers who had lost daughters, and from others who had witnessed suspicious activities. The picture that emerged was even more horrifying than the rumors had suggested. Witnesses described scenes of unimaginable brutality. Young women tortured for days, bodies disposed of in the dead of night, screams echoing from the castle towers that were explained away as the cries of wayward servants being disciplined. Some servants testified to being forced to participate in the torture or disposal of bodies, threatened with their own deaths if they refused or spoke of what they had witnessed. The investigation also revealed the extent of Elizabeth's network of accomplices. Her inner circle, Ilona Joe, Dorothea Senes, Janos Ujeri, and Catalin Benica, another servant who had joined the household, had all played active roles in the crimes. They had helped procure victims, participated in torture sessions, and disposed of bodies. Some testimony suggested that these accomplices had encouraged Elizabeth's beliefs about the restorative properties of blood, feeding her obsession with youth and beauty. Whether they truly believed in these properties themselves, or simply recognized an opportunity to maintain their positions of relative power by indulging their mistress's madness, remains unclear. By December 1610, Thurzo had gathered enough evidence to act, but he still faced the dilemma of how to proceed without creating a scandal that would reverberate throughout Hungarian society. A public trial of a countess from one of the kingdom's premier families was virtually unprecedented. The testimony would be sensational and damaging, and there was no guarantee that the legal proceedings could be controlled once they began. Thurzo made a decision that would prove controversial. He would raid the castle, gather irrefutable evidence, arrest the accomplices, but handle Elizabeth herself differently. On the night of December 29, 1610, Count Thurzo and a group of soldiers and officials arrived at Countess Castle. What they found there exceeded even the darkest testimony they had collected. According to the accounts that emerged later, they discovered a girl who had been tortured to death, her body still warm. Another victim was found dying from her wounds, and others were discovered imprisoned, showing signs of repeated abuse. In various parts of the castle, they found implements of torture, iron maidens, cages, instruments designed specifically to inflict pain. In some accounts, they discovered bodies hidden throughout the castle and grounds, though the exact number and locations have been disputed by historians. The scene must have been overwhelming even for hardened officials accustomed to the casual violence of the era. This was not the normal discipline of servants, or even the excessive punishment that some cruel nobles might inflict. This was systematic torture and murder on a scale that shocked even those who had heard the rumors and testimony. The evidence was undeniable, overwhelming, and horrifying. Elizabeth herself was found in the castle, reportedly showing little concern or remorse at the intrusion. Some accounts suggest she was indignant at the raid, insisting on her noble privileges and demanding that Thurzo leave immediately. She seemed genuinely unable to comprehend that her actions could have consequences, that her power and position would not shield her indefinitely. Her years of operating with impunity had convinced her of her own invulnerability, and even facing the Palatine of Hungary with the bodies of her victims discovered throughout her castle, she maintained an attitude of aristocratic superiority. Thurzo immediately arrested Elizabeth's accomplices, Ilona Jo, Dorothea Senes, Janos Ujeri, and Catalin Benica were all taken into custody and removed from the castle. They would face trial for their roles in the crimes. But Elizabeth herself was not arrested in the traditional sense. Instead, Thurzo declared that she would be confined to her castle, placed under house arrest while the investigation continued and decisions were made about how to proceed. The raid and its immediate aftermath created exactly the scandal that Thurzo had hoped to avoid. News of the discovery spread quickly through the region and beyond. The testimony was too sensational, the crimes too horrific to suppress entirely. Within weeks, all of Hungary was talking about the Countess Bathory and the horrors of Countess Castle. The story spread to neighboring kingdoms, carried by merchants and travelers, growing in the telling until Elizabeth Bathory became a byword for aristocratic depravity and unchecked power. In the weeks following the raid, investigators continued to search the castle and grounds. They discovered more bodies, more evidence of the systematic nature of Elizabeth's crimes. Servants were questioned extensively, and a fuller picture emerged of life within the castle during those dark years. Some testimony suggested that Elizabeth had kept records of her victims, a journal in which she documented her crimes, though this journal, if it ever truly existed, has never been found and may be apocryphal. Another dark embellishment added to an already nightmarish story. As 1610 drew to a close and 1611 began, Elizabeth remained confined at Countess Castle, waiting to learn her fate. Her accomplices sat in cells, awaiting trial. Count Thurzo grappled with the political and legal implications of what had been discovered. And throughout Hungary, people spoke in hushed tones about the Countess who would believe herself above all law, all morality, all human decency, and who had finally been proven catastrophically wrong. The question now was not whether Elizabeth Bathory was guilty, The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The question was what to do with a woman of her status, her family connections, and her wealth. The answer would prove to be almost as unusual as the crimes themselves, and would ensure that Elizabeth Bathory's story would remain controversial and debated for centuries to come. The winter of 1611 brought a trial unlike any that Hungary had witnessed before, a trial in which the principal accused was absent, protected by her noble status, even as the full scope of her crimes was laid bare before the court. While Elizabeth Bathory remained confined within the walls of Countess Castle, her 4 accomplices faced justice in the town of Bedtime, where Count Georgi Thurzo had convened a tribunal to examine the horrors that had been uncovered. The trial began on January 2nd, 1611, mere days after the raid on Countess Castle. The proceedings were swift by the standards of the era, driven forward by the weight of evidence and the dozens of witnesses ready to testify. Thurzo himself presided over the court, and 21 judges were assembled to hear the case. An unusually large panel that spoke to the gravity of the charges and perhaps to the political sensitivity of trying servants and accomplices of one of Hungary's most powerful families. The courtroom was packed with observers, nobles and commoners alike, all eager to hear the testimony about crimes that had shocked the kingdom. The accused, Ilona Joe, Dorothea Senis, Janos Ujeri called Fixco, and Catalin Benica, stood before the court in chains. They knew their fate was likely sealed before the proceedings even began. In an age when confession was often obtained through torture, and when the testimony of lower-class defendants carried little weight against that of their social superiors, they had few options for defense. Their best hope lay in cooperation, in providing testimony that might spare them the most excruciating forms of execution, though even that hope was slim. The prosecution called forth witness after witness, building a case of almost unimaginable horror. Former servants from Countess Castle testified to what they had seen and heard during their time in Elizabeth's employ. They spoke of girls arriving at the castle with hope in their eyes, only to disappear within days or weeks. They described screams echoing through the corridors at night, blood-stained clothing being washed in secret, and bodies being carried from the castle under cover of darkness for burial in unmarked graves. One witness, a woman named Susanna, who had served as a washerwoman at the castle, provided particularly damning testimony. She described being forced to clean clothing so saturated with blood that the water in her washing tubs turned crimson. She told the court of seeing young girls with burns covering their bodies, of witnessing torture sessions through cracked doorways, and of being threatened with death if she spoke of what she had seen. Her testimony, delivered in a trembling voice, painted a picture of a household where terror was the norm and where servants lived in constant fear of becoming victims themselves. Another witness, a castle steward named Benedek Deseo, testified about the disposal of bodies. He described being ordered to bury corpses in the dead of night, often in locations throughout the castle grounds or in nearby fields. He estimated that he had personally been involved in the burial of dozens of victims, though he could not provide an exact count. His testimony suggested that the killings had been going on for years, perhaps even before Ferenc Nadisti's death, though they had accelerated dramatically after 1604. The trial also heard from families of victims, mothers who had sent their daughters to the castle for service or education and never seen them again. A woman named Ilona Joe, not to be confused with Elizabeth's accomplice of the same first name, testified about her daughter Anna, who had been promised a position as a seamstress at Countess Castle. Anna had written home once, describing the castle and expressing excitement about her new position. Then the letters stopped. When Ilona traveled to the castle to inquire about her daughter, she was told that Anna had run away, possibly with a young man, and that the Countess was quite displeased with such behavior. But Anna never came home, and her body was never found. This story was repeated, with variations, by family after family. Daughters who vanished, inquiries that were rebuffed, and the creeping certainty that something terrible had happened. The accused accomplices, faced with this overwhelming testimony and seeing no path to acquittal, began to confess. Relaxation, the former wet nurse called Dorka, admitted to participating in the torture and killing of numerous young women. She described how Elizabeth would order girls brought to her chambers, where they would be stripped, beaten, burned with hot irons, and tortured in various ways until they died from their injuries or from shock and blood loss. Dorka claimed that Elizabeth herself often participated directly in these sessions, striking victims with her own hands and sometimes biting their flesh in fits of rage. Janos Ujeri, Fixco the dwarf, provided testimony that suggested the torture had been inventive and varied. He described victims being forced into cages lined with spikes, being burned with hot coins, having their fingers crushed with implements designed specifically for that purpose, and being subjected to prolonged beatings that lasted for hours. He testified that Elizabeth seemed to derive pleasure from watching the suffering, that she would sometimes have victims tortured in her presence while she ate her meals or conducted her correspondence, as if their agony were mere background entertainment. Alona Joe, who had come to the castle around 1600 and who possessed knowledge of folk magic and occult practices, testified about Elizabeth's obsession with blood and youth. She confirmed the rumors that Elizabeth believed bathing in or being splattered with the blood of young virgins would preserve her beauty and restore her youth. Joe described rituals that blended folk superstition with Elizabeth's vanity, creating a twisted belief system that justified murder as a means to eternal youth. Whether Joe had encouraged these beliefs or simply exploited them to maintain her position in the household remained unclear, but her testimony provided insight into Elizabeth's psychological state and her descent into madness. The most chilling testimony came when the court attempted to establish the number of victims. The accomplices provided varying estimates, none of them certain. Dorka suggested there had been around 40 victims during her time at the castle. Fixco claimed to have helped dispose of more than 50 bodies. But then emerged a reference to a registry, a document allegedly kept by one of Elizabeth's servants that listed the names of victims. According to testimony, this registry contained over 600 names, though the document itself was never produced in court and may never have existed beyond rumor and speculation. Modern historians debate this figure intensely. 600 victims over the approximately 6 to 10 years of Elizabeth's most active period would require an extraordinarily high rate of killing, more than one per week. That seems difficult to sustain without detection, even given her power and isolation. Some scholars suggest the number may have been exaggerated by prosecutors seeking to emphasize the enormity of the crimes, or inflated by frightened accomplices hoping to demonstrate their cooperation. Others argue that given the transient nature of servants in large households and the isolation of rural Hungary, such a death toll might indeed have been possible. The true number will likely never be known with certainty, but even the most conservative estimates place Elizabeth Bathory among the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. The verdict was delivered swiftly. All 4 accomplices were found guilty of murder and complicity in crimes of unspeakable cruelty. Their sentences reflected the brutality of the age and the enormity of their crimes. Alona Joe and Relaxation, as the primary accomplices who had directly participated in torture and killing, were sentenced to death in the most horrific manner. Their fingers, which had been used to torture victims, were to be torn out with red-hot pincers, and then they were to be burned alive at the stake. Janos Ujeri, Fixco, despite his lesser status and his claims of following orders, received the same sentence. Catalin Banica, whose role appeared to be somewhat less direct, was sentenced to life imprisonment. The executions were carried out immediately after sentencing, a public spectacle that drew crowds from across the region. On a cold January day, the three condemned accomplices were led to the place of execution. The gruesome ritual of their deaths served as both punishment and warning, a demonstration that even servants of the powerful could not escape justice for such crimes. Their screams as the red-hot pincers tore at their flesh, and their agonized cries as the flames consumed them, were meant to satisfy the public demand for vengeance and to serve as a deterrent to others who might be tempted to follow similar paths. But throughout all of this, the testimony, the confessions, the verdicts, and the executions, one person remained notably absent. Elizabeth Bathory herself never stood before the court. She was never formally charged, never forced to answer for her crimes in a public forum, never subjected to the legal process that had condemned her accomplices to such terrible deaths. Count Thurzo had made his decision. Elizabeth would not face a public trial. The reasons for this decision were complex and political. A trial of Elizabeth Bathory would require her family, the powerful Bathory clan, to appear and potentially testify. It would expose the nobility to public scrutiny and scandal on an unprecedented scale. It would reveal the extent to which aristocratic privilege had allowed these crimes to continue unchecked for years. And perhaps most pragmatically, it would complicate matters of inheritance and property, as Elizabeth's children were innocent of her crimes and deserved to inherit their share of the family wealth without it being tainted by formal conviction and confiscation. So instead, Thurzo chose a different path, one that would prove controversial then and remains debated by historians now. Elizabeth Bathory would be punished, but her punishment would be carried out quietly, without the spectacle of a trial, without the formal legal proceedings that might protect her through appeals or technicalities. She would simply be made to disappear, locked away where she could harm no one else, forgotten by the world she had once dominated. In the months following the trial of her accomplices, Elizabeth Bathory's fate was sealed not by judicial decree, but by family decision and political expediency. Count Georgi Thurzo, having consulted with other members of the Bathory family and considering the delicate political situation, determined that Elizabeth would be confined for the remainder of her life. But the nature of that confinement would be unlike any imprisonment imposed on a member of the Hungarian nobility before or since. Elizabeth remained at Cactus Castle, the fortress that had been both her seat of power and the scene of her crimes. But she would no longer rule there, no longer move freely through its halls and chambers. Instead, in early 1611, masons were summoned to the castle to carry out an extraordinary construction project. They were to seal Elizabeth Bathory inside her own apartments, transforming her living quarters into a tomb from which she would never emerge. The work was carried out with grim efficiency. Stone masons bricked up the doorways to Elizabeth's chambers, creating walls where entrances had been. Windows were covered with iron bars and then boarded over, cutting off her view of the outside world. When the construction was complete, Elizabeth's apartment consisted of a few rooms with no doors and no windows. Only small slits left open for ventilation and for passing food and removing waste. She could see nothing of the castle grounds, nothing of the mountains beyond, nothing of the world she had once dominated. She was entombed alive, sealed away like a dangerous relic that could neither be destroyed nor displayed. The symbolism of this punishment was profound and deliberate. Elizabeth would not be executed. as this would require a formal trial and conviction that the family wished to avoid. She would not be exiled, as this would allow her to potentially rebuild influence elsewhere. She would not be sent to a convent, as this might be seen as too lenient and would burden the church with her maintenance. Instead, she would simply cease to exist in any meaningful way, removed from society as thoroughly as if she had died, yet kept alive in her sealed chambers as a living ghost. The psychological impact of this confinement must have been devastating. Elizabeth, who had spent her entire life in positions of power and privilege, who had commanded hundreds of servants and controlled vast estates, who had traveled between multiple castles and moved through society as one of its most prominent figures, now found herself in a space measuring perhaps 30 feet by 20 feet, with no human contact beyond the guards who passed her food through the slots in her walls. The woman who had been obsessed with beauty and youth was now sealed away where no one could see her aging face, where no mirror would reflect back the passage of time she had fought so desperately to prevent. Yet even in confinement, Elizabeth retained certain privileges that spoke to her noble status. She was allowed writing materials. Parchment, ink, and quills were passed through the slots in her walls. She could compose letters, though whether these were ever sent or simply collected by her jailers remains unclear. She was provided with adequate food, not the prison rations that a common criminal might receive, but meals appropriate to her station. She had basic furnishings, a bed, a table, a chair, though nothing of luxury or comfort, and she was attended by guards who maintained watch over her sealed chambers at all times, ensuring she could not escape and that no one could free her. From these sealed rooms, Elizabeth could hear the life of the castle continuing around her. She could hear the footsteps of servants in corridors she could no longer access, the sounds of daily activities in spaces she could no longer see, the voices of people going about their business in a world from which she had been permanently excluded. Some accounts suggest that in the early days of her imprisonment, she would call out to those who passed near her chambers, demanding to be released, insisting on her rights as a countess, threatening consequences that she no longer had the power to impose. But as time passed, these outbursts apparently became less frequent, and a grim silence settled over the sealed apartments. The legal and financial aftermath of Elizabeth's confinement was complex and revealing. Despite the overwhelming evidence of her crimes and the execution of her accomplices, Elizabeth was never formally convicted of any wrongdoing. This legal limbo had significant implications for her property and wealth. Had she been convicted, her estates would likely have been confiscated by the crown, her debts would have been nullified, and her family would have lost much of their wealth and status. Instead, because she was merely confined without trial, her property technically remained hers, though she could not administer it. The management of Elizabeth's vast estates fell to her children and to appointed administrators. Her son Pal, who was still relatively young, inherited the bulk of the Natesty properties. Her daughters, Anna and Catalin, Ursula had died young, received their portions of the family wealth. The Bathory family worked diligently to distance themselves from Elizabeth's crimes, emphasizing that she had acted alone in her madness, and that the family name should not be tarnished by the actions of one member, however monstrous those actions had been. There was also the matter of Elizabeth's debts to various nobles and potentially to the royal treasury. Some historians have suggested that the motivation for confining Elizabeth rather than executing her may have been partially financial. Living but imprisoned, she could not press her claims for repayment, but neither could the debts be formally declared void through conviction and execution. This allowed certain powerful figures to effectively erase their obligations to her, while maintaining the appearance of legal propriety. Whether this was a primary motivation or simply a convenient side effect of the decision to confine her remains a matter of historical debate. Life in the sealed chambers continued in a monotonous rhythm. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Elizabeth, who had once filled her time with the administration of estates, the education of her children, social correspondence with other nobles, and, in those dark final years, the torture and murder of young women, now had nothing but endless empty hours. Some accounts suggest she spent her time in prayer, attempting to make peace with God for her crimes, though whether this represented genuine repentance or simply the desperate hope of avoiding eternal damnation is impossible to know. She was allowed certain possessions, her clothing, though she had no one to see her wear it, books, though the light filtering through the small ventilation slits must have made reading difficult, and her writing materials. According to some sources, she continued to write letters to her children, though these were likely intercepted by her guards and may never have been delivered. In these letters, if the accounts are accurate, Elizabeth protested her innocence, claimed she had been the victim of a conspiracy, and insisted that her confinement was unjust. Whether she truly believed this, or whether it was simply the last refuge of a mind unable to accept the enormity of what she had done, remains another of the many mysteries surrounding her story. The world outside her sealed chambers continued to turn. News occasionally filtered in through her guards, information about her children, about political developments in Hungary, about the ongoing conflicts with the Ottoman Empire. But Elizabeth was no longer a participant in these events, no longer a player on the stage of Hungarian politics and society. She had become a cautionary tale, a story told in whispers, a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the corruption that absolute privilege could breed. In the villages surrounding Countess Castle, life slowly returned to normal. Families no longer lived in fear of their daughters being taken to serve at the castle. The rumors and the terror gradually faded, replaced by a wary relief and eventually by the simple routines of peasant life. But the memory of what had happened remained, passed down through generations, growing in the telling until Elizabeth Bathory became more legend than history, more monster than woman. Inside her sealed tomb, Elizabeth continued to exist in a state somewhere between life and death, between punishment and mercy, between justice and expedience. The walls around her were thick stone, but they were nothing compared to the walls of silence and deliberate forgetting that Hungarian society had erected around her story. She had been removed from history even as she continued to breathe, made into a non-person whose crimes were too scandalous to fully acknowledge and whose punishment was too unusual to defend under any recognized system of law. And in those dark, sealed chambers, as the months turned into years, Elizabeth Bathory, once one of the most powerful women in Hungary, once a countess who believed herself above all law and consequence, lived out her remaining days in isolation, darkness, and silence, waiting for the death that would finally release her from the living tomb that had become her entire world. For nearly 4 years, Elizabeth Bathory lived in her sealed chambers at Countess Castle, cut off from the world she had once commanded. The exact details of her daily existence during this period remain largely unknown, hidden behind the bricked-up walls and the deliberate silence that her family and Hungarian society imposed upon her story. But on August 21st, 1614, that strange, suspended existence finally came to an end. The guards who attended Elizabeth's sealed apartments noticed something unusual that summer day, an absence of the sounds that had become familiar over the years of her confinement. There were no movements from within the chambers, no responses when food was brought to the slot in the wall, no signs of life from the woman who had been both prisoner and prisoner's keeper of her own dark legacy. When they finally investigated, opening the sealed chambers that had been her world for so long, they found Elizabeth Bathory lying on her bed, dead. She was 54 years old. The official cause of death was not recorded with any detail, though given her age and the conditions of her confinement, it could have been any number of ailments. Some accounts suggest she had been in declining health for some time, suffering from ailments that went untreated in her isolation. There were whispers, of course. There were always whispers surrounding Elizabeth Bathory, that she had died raging against her confinement, that she had starved herself in protest, that she had succumbed to madness. But the truth, like so much else about her final years, disappeared behind the walls of silence that surrounded her story. Elizabeth's death presented yet another dilemma for her family and for Count Thurzo. How does one bury a woman who was never officially convicted of crimes, yet whose guilt was known to everyone? How does one honor the noble status of a countess while acknowledging the monster she had been? The solution, once again, reflected the uncomfortable compromise between justice and aristocratic privilege that had characterized Elizabeth's treatment since her confinement. She was not given a grand funeral befitting her status as a countess and member of one of Hungary's premier families. There was no elaborate ceremony, no procession of nobles, no public mourning. But neither was she buried in unconsecrated ground like a criminal or suicide. Instead, Elizabeth Bathory was buried quietly, almost secretly, in the church at Cactus, near the castle where she had committed her crimes and spent her final years imprisoned. The burial was conducted with minimal ceremony, attended only by a few family members and officials, and recorded in the church registry with little fanfare. But even this burial would not be Elizabeth's final resting place. The people of Cactus, still traumatized by the horrors that had occurred in their midst, objected strongly to having the Countess's body interred in their church. The presence of her grave, they felt, would be a perpetual reminder of the suffering she had caused, a desecration of holy ground. Their protests were apparently heard, and Elizabeth's body was exhumed and moved to her family's traditional burial grounds at Ext, in northeastern Hungary, where generations of Bathorys had been laid to rest. Even in death, Elizabeth was unwelcome, rejected by the community she had terrorized, relegated to a distant family plot where her grave would attract less attention and fewer bitter memories. The exact location of her grave at Ext has been lost to history. The church and graveyard where she was supposedly buried were later destroyed, the markers and monuments scattered or obliterated by time and conflict. Whether this was deliberate, an attempt by her family to erase even the physical evidence of her existence, or simply the result of the many wars and upheavals that swept through Hungary in the centuries that followed, remains unclear. But the effect was the same. Elizabeth Bathory, who had once commanded vast estates and exercised power over thousands of lives, has no known grave, no monument, no place where her physical remains can be definitively located. In the immediate aftermath of her death, the Bathory family worked diligently to suppress the story of Elizabeth's crimes. Documents were destroyed or hidden away. References to the trial of her accomplices were minimized. The family emphasized their continued service to Hungary, their loyalty to the crown, their contributions to the defense against the Ottoman Empire. They distanced themselves from Elizabeth, treating her as an aberration, a single corrupted individual whose actions should not taint the entire lineage. For a time, this strategy appeared to work. Within a generation, the Bathory name had recovered much of its prestige. Elizabeth's children lived out their lives in relative obscurity but respectability. Her son Pal managed the family estates and maintained the family's position among the Hungarian nobility. Her daughters married and produced heirs of their own. The immediate scandal faded as new crises and concerns captured public attention. Wars, political upheavals, the ongoing struggle against Ottoman expansion. But the story of Elizabeth Bathory could not be completely suppressed. It lingered in folk memory, particularly in the regions around Countess and the other estates where she had ruled. Mothers told their daughters about the blood countess who had stolen young women away. Storytellers embellished the tale, adding details both real and imagined, until it was difficult to separate fact from fiction. The story grew darker in the telling, more fantastical, more horrifying. Elizabeth became not just a murderess, but a vampire, not just a torturer, but a practitioner of the darkest magic, not just a serial killer, but something inhuman and monstrous. The number of her victims grew in these folk tales, inflated from the dozens or possibly hundreds that historical evidence suggests to the legendary 610 that some accounts claimed. The story of her bathing in blood, which may have been an actual practice or may have been a later embellishment, became the central image of her legend, the defining characteristic by which she would be remembered. Elizabeth Bathory, Countess of Blood, became a figure of nightmare, a cautionary tale about vanity and power and the corruption of the soul. Over the centuries, Elizabeth's story has been repeatedly rediscovered, reinterpreted, and reimagined. In the 18th century, writers began to record the folk tales and legends that had grown up around her. In the 19th century, as interest in Gothic horror flourished, Elizabeth became a popular subject for sensationalist accounts that freely mixed fact with fiction. She was linked to vampire legends, and some writers suggested she had been an inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula, though this connection is historically questionable and likely apocryphal. In the 20th and 21st centuries, historians have attempted to separate fact from legend, to understand Elizabeth Bathory as a historical figure rather than a monster of folklore. They have examined the trial records of her accomplices, studied the social and political context of early 17th century Hungary, and attempted to understand what drove a woman of intelligence, education, and privilege to commit such horrific crimes. Was she mentally ill, perhaps suffering from a condition that manifested in violent psychosis? Was she a sadistic predator who used her power to indulge dark compulsions? Was she the victim of a conspiracy, her crimes exaggerated or even fabricated by political enemies seeking to seize her wealth? Most serious historians conclude that while some details of the traditional story may have been exaggerated, the core truth is undeniable. Elizabeth Bathory tortured and killed young women, probably dozens of them, possibly more. The evidence from the trial of her accomplices, the testimony of witnesses, and the physical evidence found at Countess Castle all point to the same conclusion. Whether she bathed in blood, whether she killed 600 victims or 60, whether she was driven by vanity or sadism or madness, these details may be debated. But that she was a serial killer of extraordinary cruelty is beyond reasonable doubt. Elizabeth Bathory's legacy is complex and disturbing. She has become a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power, of what happens when wealth and privilege place someone above the law for so long that they lose all sense of moral restraint. Her story raises uncomfortable questions about justice and class privilege, questions that remain relevant centuries later. She was punished, but never tried. Her accomplices were executed, but she was merely confined. Her crimes were acknowledged, but never formally adjudicated. This strange, compromised resolution ensured that her story would remain controversial and would continue to fascinate those interested in true crime, social history, and the darker aspects of human nature. In popular culture, Elizabeth Bathory has become an enduring figure of horror. She appears in novels, films, television shows, and other media, usually portrayed as a vampire or witch, often with supernatural powers that the historical Elizabeth never possessed. These fictionalized versions tell us perhaps more about our own fascinations with beauty, mortality, and transgression than they do about the actual woman who lived and died 4 centuries ago. But beyond the legends and the horror stories, beyond the sensationalism and speculation, there remains a historical truth. Elizabeth Bathory was a real woman who committed real crimes that caused real suffering to real victims. Young women whose names we mostly don't know, whose families mourn them, whose lives were cut short by torture and murder. They are the ones who deserve to be remembered, even as we grapple with the dark legacy of the woman who destroyed them. And so the story of Elizabeth Bathory ends where it must, not with the Countess herself, but with the memory of those she harmed, the lives she destroyed, and the warning her story provides about the corruption that absolute power can breed in even the most privileged and educated individuals. From the castle towers of Cactus to an unmarked grave somewhere in the Hungarian plains, from historical fact to eternal legend, the tale of the Blood Countess remains one of history's darkest and most disturbing chapters. This concludes this journey through the history of Elizabeth Bathory's life. Thank you for listening, and be sure and subscribe and turn on notifications so you know when the next journey through history is ready to embark on. Thanks again, and have a good night.